The enemy commander laughed when his scouts reported back. 400 of America's best SEALs, Rangers saw he get paramilitaries funneling straight into his canyon like cattle walking into a slaughterhouse. He had spent 6 months building that kill box. 6 months of patience, of waiting, of burying machine gun nests into the rock itself. He lit a cigarette, looked down at the canyon below, and said to his lieutenant, "Not one of them comes home today." He was right about almost everything. He just didn't know about the cook. Before we go any further, if stories like this hit you somewhere deep, somewhere real, subscribe to this channel right now and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you are watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all begins. Nobody at Forward Operating Base Griffin ever gave Riley Callahan a second look. That was the point. She moved through the mess hall the way certain people move through the world, quietly, efficiently, without demanding anything from the space around her. She kept her hair pulled back tight under a standard issue contractor cap. She wore the same faded gray thermal underneath the same grease-stained apron every single day. She smiled when smiled at, nodded when nodded to, and refilled coffee without being asked. She was by every visible measurement just the cook. That was the point too. FOB Griffin had perched at 8,000 feet above sea level on a ridgeline so narrow and so brutal that the Air Force engineers who first surveyed it had reportedly turned to each other and said, "You're serious." The base looked out over a canyon the locals called Shaitan's Anvil, the Devil's Anvil, a geological nightmare of vertical walls, switchback trails, thermal wind currents that could flip a helicopter sideways in seconds, and enough natural choke points that any tactician worth his salt would have looked at it once and said, "Nobody fights in there by choice." That canyon was about to become the most important piece of ground in the entire operation. But on the morning it all started, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was breakfast. Riley had been up since 0330. She always was. The generators kicked on at 0345, and by the time the first operators shuffled into the mess hall at 0500, she had eggs going on 2 flat-top grills, 4 different coffee stations running, and enough prepackaged MRE supplements laid out on the serving line to feed a small army, which was in fact exactly what she was doing. The SEALs came first. They always did. Some of them were polite. Most of them were too focused to be anything. They moved with that particular kind of contained energy, like engines running at low idle, waiting to be opened up. They took their trays, ate fast, and talked in the low tactical shorthand that sounded like a different language to anyone who hadn't spent years inside the machine. Riley understood every word. She didn't react to any of it. Staff Sergeant Dennis Kowalski was the first one to say something to her that morning. He came through the line early before most of his squad, and he was in a bad mood. She could tell by the way he set his tray down, not hard enough to be a scene, but hard enough to say something. "Eggs are runny again," he said, not to her specifically, more to the universe. "They were fine 10 minutes ago," Riley said, already reaching for the spatula to replace them. "You were late." Kowalski looked at her. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that by a contractor. Most of the support staff at Griffin had learned to keep their heads down around operators who were pre-mission tense. "Excuse me, I said the eggs were fine 10 minutes ago." She didn't look up. "You want new ones? I'll make new ones. Takes 3 minutes. You got 3 minutes." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he almost smiled. Almost. "Yeah, I got 3 minutes." "Then sit down." He sat. That was the thing about Riley that nobody ever quite figured out. She didn't try to make people like her. She didn't try to make them uncomfortable either. She just moved through the world with this quiet steadiness that was either completely ordinary or something else entirely, depending on how closely you were paying attention. And at FOB Griffin, nobody paid close attention to the cook. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hayes was different. Hayes had been running SEAL operations for 19 years. He had the kind of eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything, and the kind of mind that filed away details, the way other people filed away tax returns automatically, efficiently, with the understanding that you might need them later, even if you couldn't see why yet. He had noticed Riley Callahan on day 3 of the FOB Griffin deployment, not in any particular way, not in any way he could have specifically explained. It was just she was too steady. The mess hall was a pressure cooker environment before a major operation. People cracked, People got short, people snapped at each other and spilled things and forgot orders and generally behaved the way human beings behaved when they were afraid and trying to pretend they weren't. Riley never did any of that. She moved through the chaos with a stillness that Hayes associated with exactly one type of person in his entire 19-year career. The type of person who had already been in worse situations than this one and come out the other side. He filed it away and said nothing. The mission briefing that morning was at 05:30 in the operations tent, and Riley didn't attend it. Of course she didn't. She was a civilian contractor, a cook. The briefing was for operators, intelligence personnel, and command staff only. But the operations tent shared a thin plywood wall with the supply room adjacent to the mess hall, and Riley had very good hearing. She wasn't trying to listen. She told herself that. She was restocking the dried goods shelf, and the briefing simply carried. Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Walsh's voice was the loudest. Walsh was the kind of commander who had risen fast on confidence and charisma, and the ability to make a plan sound airtight even when it had holes in it. Riley had known men like Walsh her entire career. They were magnetic in the briefing room. They were sometimes catastrophic in the field. 400 operators, gentlemen, Walsh was saying. Moving in a modified wedge formation through the Devil's Anvil approach route, we hit the target compound at the far end of the canyon at approximately 0900. The target, Yusuf al-Rashid, senior bomb-making engineer, does not leave that compound alive or uncaptured. Questions? There was a pause. Riley restocked canned goods and listened. What's the current read on enemy disposition in the canyon itself? That was Hayes. She recognized his voice now. Low, careful, the kind of voice that didn't waste syllables. Scouts have confirmed light activity, a handful of observation posts, nothing that 400 operators can't walk through. A handful of observation posts that we can confirm, Hayes said. What about what we can't confirm? Another pause, shorter this time. Intel is confident, Chief. We move at 0600. Riley set down a can of coffee grounds and stood very still for a moment. Then she picked up the next can and kept restocking. She had calculated the problem in under 30 seconds. She had done it the way she did everything automatically from a base of experience that she was not supposed to have and that no one at FOB Griffin knew she had. The Devil's Anvil Canyon was a natural kill box. Any military tactician who had spent time in that geography would recognize it. The approach route Walsh was describing funneled 400 men into a corridor, roughly 60 meters wide at its narrowest point, with vertical rock walls on both sides rising 300 feet. Thermal winds in the canyon shifted unpredictably due to the temperature differential between the canyon floor and the ridge above. Air support would be unreliable at best, impossible at worst, and the far end of the canyon where the target compound sat was elevated slightly, which meant anyone defending it held high ground on the approach. If the enemy had anticipated this route, and a skilled commander absolutely would have 400 operators walking into that canyon was not a mission. It was a funeral. But she was the cook. She kept her mouth shut and finished restocking the shelves. The convoy began forming up at 0545. Riley came out from behind the serving line and stood near the mess hall door with a fresh urn of coffee. She didn't know why she did it. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't expected. It was just something she needed to do. She stood there and refilled cups as operators passed, and she watched them. Kowalski went by. He nodded at her, actually smiled this time, full and real the way men smile when they're amped up and trying to project certainty. Better eggs this time, he said. Glad to hear it, she said. He kept moving. She watched him go. She noticed things she wasn't supposed to notice. The rifle sling on the second operator in the fourth column was frayed at the attachment point one hard fall, and it would snap. The Ranger about 6 positions back was compensating slightly on his left side, protecting a rib or a hip, something that hadn't fully healed. The wind coming down off the ridge had shifted in the last 20 minutes, swinging from southwest to northwest, which meant the thermal patterns in the canyon would be completely different from what any pre-mission weather assessment had projected. She noticed all of it. She said none of it. At 0601, the last vehicle in the convoy disappeared through the gate. The base went quiet in the specific way that military bases go quiet when the operators have left. Not peaceful quiet, but hell-breath quiet. The support staff, the maintenance crews, the intelligence analysts who remained behind, they all moved a little more carefully, spoke a little more softly as if the weight of what was happening out there was pressing down on the air inside the wire. Riley went back into the mess hall. She cleaned the flat-top grills. She refilled the coffee stations. She sat down on an overturned crate near the front wall, and she did something that looked to anyone who might have glanced through the doorway like staring into space. She was not staring into space. She was running the canyon in her head. Every variable she had cataloged from 3 weeks of observing the landscape from the ridge during her morning supply runs. Every wind pattern she had logged mentally, every sight line from the heights, every potential covered position above the canyon floor. She ran it like a chess problem. She ran it until she had the answer, and then she sat with the answer and felt the weight of it because the answer was not good. The radio crackled at 0743. It was routine traffic at first, position checks, movement confirmations, the ordinary bureaucracy of a large-scale military operation unfolding in real time. Riley listened without appearing to listen. She had moved behind the serving line again and was prepping for the midday meal that the skeleton crew left on base would need, because that was her job, and she did her job. At 0811, the traffic changed. It was subtle at first, a longer pause between transmissions, a slightly higher pitch in the radio operator's voice when he acknowledged a position report. Small things. Riley's hands stopped moving on the cutting board. At 0819, the canyon swallowed the convoy's routine silence. At 0823, the radio operator, 3 rooms away from the mess hall, said something sharp and low that Riley couldn't make out through the wall. At 0824, every radio on the base seemed to explode at once. The voice that came through was not a communications officer reading from a script. It was raw, and it was immediate, and it was the kind of transmission that people who have worked in and around military operations hear in their nightmares for the rest of their lives. Contact all elements. Contact. We are taking fire from both ridges. We are taking fire from both ridges. Grid Whiskey, 7-4 the canyon, we are pinned. Repeat, and all 400 elements are pinned in the kill zone. I need air support now. And then static. And then another voice, calmer, but barely. Air support is unavailable. Storm system has closed the airspace. Repeat, air support is unavailable. All ground units, you are on your own. Hold your positions. And then the first voice again, and it wasn't calm anymore. It wasn't even trying to be. There is no position to hold. They have both ridges. They have everything. People are. The transmission cut. Silence. In the mess hall, Riley Callahan stood very still with a knife in her hand and her eyes on the wall in front of her, and thought about Kowalski's smile and the frayed rifle sling and the shift in the wind. She thought about 400 people in a canyon with vertical walls and no exit and no air cover. She thought about the enemy commander she had never met, and the 6 months of preparation she hadn't known about, and the patience it took to build a kill box that good. She set the knife down very carefully on the cutting board. She untied her apron. She folded it and set it next to the knife. She walked to the back of the mess hall, past the dry storage shelves she had restocked that morning, past the propane tanks and the secondary generator that nobody ever checked because it was her job to check it, to the corner of the room where a stack of equipment cases sat underneath a canvas tarpaulin that had been there since she arrived and that no one had ever asked about because nobody ever asked about anything that looked like it belonged. She knelt down. She pressed her thumb to the biometric lock on the largest case. It opened without a sound. Inside, nested in custom-cut foam, was a rifle that had no business being in a forward operating base mess hall. It was a custom-configured AXSR, a precision anti-material sniper platform chambered in .338 Norma Magnum with a suppressor system, a ballistic calculator mounted forward of the scope, and ammunition loaded in a single column of 12 match-grade rounds in a detachable magazine that Riley had hand-loaded herself 6 weeks earlier in a room she had rented under a name that wasn't hers in a town that nobody knew she'd visited. Beside it was a wind meter, a compact spotting scope, a range card she had filled out by hand over 3 weeks of early mornings on the ridge above the base before anyone else was moving. She looked at it all for a moment. She thought about everything it meant to touch this again. She thought about Kowalski. She picked up the rifle. Chief Hayes was in the command post when the intelligence sergeant grabbed his arm and pointed to the monitor showing the feed from the base's perimeter camera system. One of the cameras covered the rear of the mess hall. Hayes looked at the screen. The cook, the contractor, the woman who made the eggs every morning was moving toward the base's eastern perimeter wall. Moving with the rifle the way someone moves with a rifle when the rifle is not a new thing to them. moving with her head up and her shoulders level and her weight distributed the way it gets distributed after 10,000 hours of doing this exact thing. Hayes stared at the screen. What the intelligence sergeant started, Hayes held up one hand. Don't. Sir, she's a civilian contractor. She can't. I said don't. Hayes watched the screen. He watched Riley Callahan reach the perimeter wall, assess it in about 4 seconds, and start climbing. Don't call it in. Don't flag it. Don't say a word. Chief Hayes regulations require. Hayes turned and looked at the sergeant with the full weight of 19 years behind his eyes. Son, 400 of our people are dying in that canyon right now. Air is down. Ground backup is 40 minutes out minimum. Command is screaming into a radio that nobody is answering. He turned back to the screen. And whatever that woman is about to do, I have a feeling it's the only thing that has any chance of mattering today. The sergeant looked at the screen. Riley had reached the top of the perimeter wall. She dropped down the other side without hesitation. She disappeared into the terrain beyond the wire. Hayes turned away from the screen. He picked up his radio handset. He thought about calling it in. He thought about what would happen if he did. He thought about 400 people in a canyon. He set the radio back down. Log it as a civilian contractor departing the base for unknown reasons at 0831, he said quietly. The sergeant stared at him. Log it, Hayes said, and then pray she gets where she's going. In the canyon, the screaming had gotten worse. The enemy had planned it perfectly. 6 months of patience, 6 months of positioning, 6 months of waiting for exactly this moment. And now 400 of the best trained operators in the world were compressed into a 60-meter corridor with nowhere to go and nothing to shoot at that made any difference, because the machine gun positions were embedded in the rock itself, and the snipers on the upper ridges had angle on everything. Lieutenant Walsh was on his radio calling in requests that weren't being answered. His voice was controlled on the surface and completely unraveling underneath, and Hayes, listening to the transmissions from the command post, could hear both layers simultaneously. We need to move, someone was saying in the background of Walsh's transmission. We cannot hold this position. We have to move. Move where? Walsh's voice. Tight. Move to what? There is nothing to move to. Then we dig in. We go to ground, and we dig in, and we wait for extract. Extract is 40 minutes. We don't have 40 minutes. In the silence between transmissions, Hayes could hear it, the particular acoustic quality of a position that is taking sustained fire from above. The specific way sound bounced in a canyon like that, the way the reports overlapped and layered and made it impossible to track direction or distance. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he opened them and looked at the clock. Riley had left the wire at 0831. It was now 0847. Whatever was going to happen soon. Or it wasn't going to happen at all. On the ridge above the canyon, a place called Watchtower Ridge, by the survey maps and called nothing by anyone who had actually climbed it, because no one ever had, Riley Callahan was making the last 60 feet of a climb that she had pre-planned 3 weeks ago and told no one about. Her arms burned. Her left knee had caught a rock face at the 200-foot mark, and she could feel the swelling starting, but she knew the architecture of pain well enough to know it wasn't structural. It was manageable. It was noise she could set aside. She set it aside. She reached the top. She moved to the edge. She looked down. And in the 60 meters of canyon floor below her, she saw something that she had trained for, that she had prepared for that. She had hoped with everything in her she would never actually see 400 people. Her people, though they didn't know it, compressed and pinned and dying by degrees, while a perfectly constructed killing machine worked through them with mechanical patience. She saw the machine gun positions. She saw the angles. She saw the ridge line across the canyon. And she saw the glint. The enemy sniper was good. He was very good. He had positioned himself at a place that was invisible from below and from almost every angle except the one she was currently occupying. And he was working the canyon floor with a precision and a calm that she recognized, because she had worn that same calm herself in other canyons, in other lives, in the years before she became a cook. She pulled the wind meter. She read the number. She looked at the range card she had made. She looked at the distance, 1,800 yards. Unstable wind, 11 miles per hour base variable gusts from the northwest. Elevation differential of 60 feet between her position and his. Temperature affecting projectile velocity. A dozen other variables that she began running simultaneously The way she had always run them, the way she had been running them in the back of her mind since she pressed her thumb to that biometric lock, since she folded her apron and set it on the cutting board, since she heard Kowalski's radio go silent. She settled into position. She adjusted the ballistic calculator. She found the glint in her scope. He was there, steady, working. He didn't know she was above him. Nobody knew anybody was above him. That was the point of the position. That was why she had identified it 3 weeks ago and written it on her range card in pencil, because some part of her had known the way, that certain people who have lived inside war long enough sometimes know things before they happen. That this ridge and that canyon in this moment were all on a collision course that she couldn't stop but might be able to shape. The canyon below her was chaos. The enemy sniper was order. He was the reason the chaos was going to win. She matched her breathing to the wind pattern. She let one breath go. She let the next one come. She let it half out. She stopped. The world went very still. 1,800 yards. She had made longer shots. She settled her finger against the trigger with the pressure of a question, not an answer. The wind held for exactly 2 seconds. She made it an answer. The suppressed report was almost polite. A dry crack that absorbed into the rock and the thin mountain air, almost immediately leaving nothing but the equation of physics round distance. Wind correction flight time of 2.3 seconds, and then the glint across the canyon that had been a problem ceased to be a problem. Silence flooded across the canyon, not the silence of quiet, the silence of something large and mechanical suddenly missing a piece it couldn't function without. And in the mess hall of Fort B. Griffin 3 miles away, a folded apron sat next to a cutting knife on a stainless steel counter, waiting for the story to catch up to the person who had left it there. The silence lasted 4 seconds. That was how long it took for the canyon to process what had just happened. 4 seconds where the machine gun stopped tracking, where the radio transmissions went dead, where 400 pinned operators bleeding, flattened against rock, burning through ammunition. They couldn't afford to burn collectively, held their breath without knowing why. Then the canyon erupted again. But something was different. Hayes heard it first. He was standing in the command post with his hand pressed flat against the radio table, listening to the transmission feed from Walsh's position, and in the middle of all that noise and chaos, in the specific kind of organized screaming that happens when trained people are dying faster than they can adapt, he heard it, a pause, a gap. Not in the radio traffic, but underneath it, in the quality of the background audio coming through Walsh's open mic. The sniper had stopped shooting. Hayes had spent 19 years learning the difference between a shooter who had stopped because he was repositioning and a shooter who had stopped because something had happened to him. They sounded different. The gap sounded different. This gap had a finality to it that Hayes recognized in the same wordless way he recognized everything that 19 years had taught him. He looked at the clock, 8:49. Riley had gone over the wire at 08:31, 18 minutes. He pressed the radio handset. Walsh, this is Hayes at command. Talk to me. What just changed? Walsh's voice came back ragged and fast. Something changed on the East Ridge. The long gun went quiet. I don't have eyes on why I don't. A burst of static. Then Hayes, we still have 2 heavy positions on the west wall and an RPG team on the southern approach. We are still pinned. Whatever just happened, it didn't fix this. I know, Hayes said, but it's a start. He set the radio down. He looked at the intelligence sergeant who was staring at the perimeter camera feed on the monitor. The camera showed nothing but empty terrain beyond the wire. Riley was gone, absorbed into the mountain, like she had always been part of it. She made it to the ridge, the sergeant said quietly. It wasn't a question. She made it to the ridge, Hayes confirmed. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. Then Hayes picked the radio back up because 400 people were still dying in a canyon, and a single shot, no matter how precise, no matter how impossible, was not a rescue. It was a signal, and now it was his job to figure out how to use it. On Watchtower Ridge, Riley wasn't thinking about signals. She was thinking about the 2 heavy machine gun positions on the West Canyon wall that she had identified from her range card, and she was thinking about the geometry of her current firing position, and she was thinking about whether the angle gave her a viable solution on either emplacement without relocating. It didn't. Not cleanly. She needed to move 30 meters south along the ridgeline to open up a sight line on the first emplacement. 30 meters across exposed rock at 8,000 feet, with a wind that was building from the northwest and a knee that was complaining loudly enough now that she had given it a category name in her head: manageable problem, not a stopping problem. She moved. She moved the way she had always moved in these situations, low and deliberate and without hesitation. Because hesitation was the thing that got people killed on ridgelines. Not speed, not aggression, but hesitation. The moment between deciding to move and moving was where bullets found people. She had learned that in places she no longer officially existed and from people whose names she had been told to forget. She hadn't forgotten any of it. 30 meters, 12 seconds. She settled into the new position and acquired the first heavy emplacement through her scope. The crew was 3 men. They had the gun positioned behind a natural rock shelf that made them nearly invisible from the canyon floor, which was why 400 operators hadn't been able to suppress it. From below, it was a ghost. From above at this angle, it was a geometry problem with a very clean solution. Distance 1,400 yards. Wind correction adjusted. She ran the calculation. She took the shot. The gun went silent mid-burst. Below in the canyon, it registered as a sudden gap in the wall of incoming fire from the west. Walsh felt it before he understood it. His radio operator grabbed his sleeve. "Sir, West position 2, just went quiet." Walsh looked up. He couldn't see the west wall from his position. He couldn't see anything except rock and the backs of his men flattened behind whatever cover they had found. Confirmed. Confirmed, position 2 is not firing. Walsh processed that. Position 2 had been the most accurate of the 3 heavy emplacements. It had been chewing through his forward element for the past 26 minutes. Now it was gone. In position 1, the sniper on the east ridge had gone dark 11 minutes ago. He looked at his radio, he looked at his map, he looked at the canyon walls rising above him on both sides. "Hayes," he said into the radio, "something is working our side of this." "I know," Hayes said. "Let it work. I need to know what I'm dealing with. I need to understand the asset." "Negative, you don't need to understand it. You need to use it. When the second west position drops, you push your alpha element forward 20 meters to the rockfall at grid whiskey 76. You hold there and you wait." Walsh stared at his radio. In 19 years in naval special warfare, nobody had ever talked to him like that during an active engagement. Certainly not a senior enlisted man from a command post 3 miles away. Certainly not during an operation he was running. He opened his mouth. Then he thought about the sniper that had gone dark. He thought about the west position that had gone silent 30 seconds ago. He thought about the fact that something was happening on that ridge line that he couldn't explain and couldn't control, and that was against every statistical probability going the right direction. He closed his mouth. "Alpha element," he said. "Prepare to push forward on my mark." And on Watchtower Ridge, Riley had already moved again. The second west emplacement was the problem. It was set back 15 meters deeper into a crack in the rock face, which meant the angle she had used for position 2 didn't give her a clean solution on position 3. She needed elevation another 12 feet of it, and the only way to get 12 more feet on this ridge line was to climb the outcropping she had been deliberately avoiding because it was exposed on 3 sides and anyone on the southern approach with a decent rifle could see it. She looked at the outcropping. She looked at the canyon below. She thought about the RPG team Walsh had mentioned. Southern approach. She made the calculation. The RPG team's likely position put them at an angle that made the outcropping's exposed southern face a risk, but not a certainty. They would need to know she was there. They would need to be looking, and they would need to be looking in exactly the right direction at exactly the right moment. 3 conditions that all had to be true simultaneously. In probability terms, it was manageable. In real terms, that meant climbing a piece of exposed rock with a rifle and a bad knee, and trusting mathematics over instinct. She climbed. 8 feet up, she heard the RPG, not the impact, the launch. The specific pneumatic hiss of the backblast that precedes the round by a quarter second if you know what you're listening for. She pressed flat against the rock face. The round hit 20 meters to her left, aimed at the muzzle flash from her last shot, which she had already vacated. The concussion rolled across the ridge, and she felt it in her chest like a punch. Rock fragments. A sharp line of pain across her left forearm. She looked at the arm. Laceration. Deep but not arterial. Another manageable problem. She kept climbing. At the top of the outcropping, she had her angle on the second west emplacement, and she had 3 seconds before the RPG team reacquired, and she used all 3 of them: range verification, wind correction, breath trigger. The second West position went silent. She was already moving off the outcropping before the sound of her own shot finished echoing. In the command post, Hayes heard Walsh's transmission change. Not the words, the tone, the specific quality that a commander's voice takes when the math of survival starts shifting in his favor. It was one of the rarest sounds Hayes had ever heard in 19 years, and he had heard it maybe a dozen times, and every time it meant the same thing: this is still terrible, but we are no longer certainly dead. Second West position down, Walsh said. Alpha element push forward, move, move, move. The surge of static that followed was operators moving the sound of controlled bodies in motion after 26 minutes of static, of waiting, of holding ground that was killing them. Hayes could hear the difference in the transmissions. The background noise of the radio had been compression and flat suppression fire. Now it was feet and gear and the low aggressive commands of squad leaders pushing their elements forward into the gap that had opened. It wasn't over. There was still the RPG team. There were still 2 observation posts on the northern approach that had been directing fire throughout the engagement. There were still an unknown number of enemy fighters between the canyon entrance and the target compound at the far end. But the kill box had a hole in it, and into that hole 400 operators were beginning to pour. Hayes, Walsh's voice. Different now, still pressured, but something new underneath it. Something that sounded almost like awe, which Hayes had never heard from Walsh in his entire career. Hayes, something is still working from above. RPG team, they're not transmitting anymore. Northern observation posts are taking fire from the ridge. Hayes, what do we have up there? Hayes looked at the intelligence sergeant. The sergeant looked back at him. You have what you have, Hayes said. Use it. Walsh was quiet for a moment. Then roger that. It was the first time in Hayes's experience that Lieutenant Colonel Walsh had ever said roger that to a senior enlisted man, without argument, without qualification, without inserting his own authority into the space between the request and the compliance. In 19 years, Hayes had never heard it. He noted it. He filed it away. He kept working. On the ridge, Riley had moved to her 4th position in 41 minutes, and her knee had passed from manageable problem into something louder that she was reclassifying in real time. The laceration on her forearm had stopped bleeding the way surface lacerations sometimes stop bleeding when you were running at high enough intensity that the body was making triage decisions without consulting you. She had 4 rounds left. She had eliminated 1 sniper, 1 heavy machine gun emplacement, 1 heavy machine gun emplacement, 1 RPG team. That was the math. She had used 8 rounds to do it. 8 rounds across 4 engagements at distances ranging from 1,400 to 1,900 yards in unstable wind conditions, with a knee that she was going to have real feelings about once the adrenaline finished its job. 4 rounds left. She used the spotting scope on the canyon below. Walsh's alpha element had pushed forward to the rockfall. Beta element was moving along the south wall using the suppression gap. She watched them move the way she had watched them at 0600 from the mess hall serving line. The same operators, the same bodies, the same frayed rifle sling on the 2nd man and 4th column that she had noticed and said nothing about, and was now watching move through a canyon that had been a killing room 40 minutes ago. The difference was they were alive. She looked at the target compound at the far end of the canyon. 2 remaining defensive positions between Walsh's forward element and the compound entrance. An elevated machine gun post on the left side of the compound wall, and a fighting position dug into the approach road itself that she could see from her angle, but that nobody at ground level could see at all. That fighting position was the problem. It was waiting. It wasn't firing. It was letting Walsh's elements advance into range before it opened up, and when it opened up, it was going to be directly in front and below, and there was going to be nowhere to go. She checked her range. She checked her wind. She checked her rounds. 4 left, 2 positions. Clean math, except the angle on the compound wall emplacement was clean from her current position. The fighting position on the approach road was not. The approach road bent slightly left, which meant the fighting position was partially deflated from her current location. She would need to see over the bend. She would need to move again to a position she had not pre-planned and had not ranged, which meant she would be shooting on raw calculation with no prior data on this specific location. With a wind that had been building for the past 20 minutes, with 4 rounds in a knee that was now sending urgent correspondence to her brain that she was continuing to not open. She looked at Walsh's forward element. They had maybe 4 minutes before they entered the killing zone of that hidden fighting position. She moved. The new position took her 2 minutes 40 seconds to reach. She acquired the fighting position through her scope. She did not have range card data for this. She estimated, not guessed, estimated, which was a word with a completely different weight behind it, the distance at 1,600 yards and applied wind correction based on what the last 40 minutes had taught her about how the air moved in this specific canyon on this specific morning. She set her elevation. She breathed. She stopped. And she heard something she had not heard in 41 minutes of working this ridgeline completely alone. A sound behind her. She went still. Completely. The way a person goes still when going still is the only correct response, and every other option is worse. Footsteps. Controlled, but not silent. Someone who was moving carefully but was not trained to move in complete silence. Someone who was trying to be quiet but didn't know how quiet actually felt. She turned her head very slowly. 15 meters behind her, coming along the ridgeline from the direction of the base, was a young man in a signals uniform who looked approximately 22 years old and approximately terrified. He was holding a handheld radio in one fist and looking at her with an expression she recognized immediately. The expression of someone who had been sent to do a job and had arrived to find the job was something completely different from what they had been told it was. He stopped moving when he saw her looking at him. Neither of them moved for a full second. Then Riley said very quietly and very evenly, "Who sent you?" Chief Hayes, ma'am," he said. The young man stopped, swallowed, tried again. "He said to find you and give you this." He held out the radio. "And to tell you Walsh is 2 minutes from the approach road." 2 minutes. She looked at the radio. She looked at the fighting position in her scope. She took the radio. She set it beside her right knee without breaking her eye to the scope. "Get behind that rock and stay there," she said. "Don't move. Don't make a sound. If something happens to me, you take the radio and you go back the way you came. You understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "You're sure?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Now be quiet." She found the fighting position again. Walsh's element was visible at the edge of her scope on the right side, the lead squad moving toward the approach road 60 seconds out from the bend. 60 seconds before the hidden position opened up on them from a direction they wouldn't see coming. She refined her elevation estimate. She made a micro correction on the wind. She had one attempt at this range with no prior data with this wind. She had one attempt and she knew it, and she accepted it the way she had accepted every hard variable in her career by getting quieter inside than the problem was loud. Her finger found the trigger. Walsh's lead squad hit the bend. She shot. The fighting position on the approach road ceased to exist as a fighting position. She was already rotating to the compound wall. Emplacement, new angle, new calculation, 200 yards closer than her previous data win, had shifted 3 degrees north in the last 90 seconds. And she made the adjustment in the time it took to breathe, and she took the second shot and the compound wall went quiet. Silence. Complete, total, breathless silence from the canyon below. Then Walsh's voice on every radio, on every frequency. "All elements push, push now, push to the compound, move, move, move." And the sound that followed the sound of 400 operators who had been dying in a canyon for 48 minutes, suddenly becoming a tide moving in one direction, was something that Riley heard from the ridgeline and recognized and felt in a place she had spent 3 years trying to seal off. The signals kid behind the rock said very quietly, "Holy." "Language," Riley said. A pause. "Sorry, ma'am." She set the rifle down on the rock in front of her. She sat back on her heels. She looked at the canyon below and watched the tide move. Her knee was sending messages that were no longer manageable correspondence. They were demands. Her forearm had started bleeding again. She had 2 rounds left in the magazine and no reason to use them. The wind was still building from the northwest, and she noted it automatically the way she noted everything, because some habits were deeper than identity. The radio next to her right knee crackled. Hayes' voice. "Callahan." She picked it up. "Here. Walsh has the compound. Engineer is in custody." A pause. "Nobody lost." She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "Acknowledged," she said. Another pause. Longer. "How bad are you?" Hayes asked. She looked at the forearm, looked at the knee. ran a quick internal inventory that took about 3 seconds and produced a clear enough picture. Ambulatory, she said. That's not what I asked. It's what I'm giving you. A beat. The kid I sent finds you, Ramirez. He'll help you get back. She looked at Ramirez, who was still behind his rock, still holding his radio, still wearing the expression of someone who had watched something happen that he did not yet have a vocabulary for. He did fine, she said. Good. Come home, Callahan. She set the radio down. She looked at the rifle. She looked at the canyon. She looked at the sky above the canyon where the sandstorm that had grounded air support was already beginning to break apart in the northwest. The way storms in that geography always eventually broke apart, suddenly completely, as if they had never been anything more than a delay. She thought about the enemy commander, the one who had lit a cigarette and looked down at the canyon and said not one of them comes home today. She thought about Kowalski, his full, real smile at 0600. Better eggs this time. She picked up the rifle. She looked at Ramirez. Can you move fast? She asked. He looked at her knee. He looked at her arm. He looked at the rifle and the spotting scope and the wind meter and the range card with 3 weeks of careful handwriting on it. He looked at the canyon below them where something had just happened that nobody was going to fully believe when they tried to explain it later. Yes, ma'am, he said. Then let's go, Riley said. And she started down off the ridge the same way she had come up, but without ceremony, without announcement, without waiting for anyone to understand what had just happened, or to give it a name, or to decide what it meant. The canyon was quiet below them. 400 operators were breathing, and the cook was going home. Ramirez didn't talk on the way down. That was the right call, and Riley noticed it. Most people talked when they were scared or overwhelmed or trying to process something their brain hadn't finished categorizing yet. They filled silence with words, the way you fill a wound with gauze, not because it helped, but because empty space felt worse than anything you could put in it. Ramirez was 22 years old and had just watched a woman with a bleeding arm and a destroyed knee take apart a kill box from 1,800 yards, with the kind of precision that most trained snipers spent entire careers chasing, and he was handling it by keeping his mouth shut and his eyes forward and matching her pace exactly. Smart kid. The descent took 31 minutes. Riley knew because she was counting the way she always counted in the field, not obsessively, not anxiously, but as a base function, the way a pilot monitors altitude. Time was data. Data kept you alive. Her knee was at a 7 by the time they hit the lower slope. She had been managing it as a 5 for the past 40 minutes through a combination of mechanics and focused refusal. But the descent was a different demand than the ridge work had been, and her body was beginning to submit invoices for expenses she hadn't acknowledged making. She paid them without comment and kept moving. At the base of the approach slope, 200 meters from the perimeter wall, Ramirez finally spoke. Ma'am, he said, can I ask you something? She glanced at him. You can ask. He was quiet for another few steps, working up to it. How long did it take you to learn to shoot like that? She thought about it. The real answer was complicated and long. It involved places and people and programs that officially didn't exist. And the short answer was probably not what he was actually asking, because the thing people were always actually asking when they asked that question was not about the technical skill. It was about the thing underneath the technical skill. The thing that let you lie flat on a rock at 8,000 feet with 2 bleeding wounds and 4 rounds in the magazine and still make the calculation come out right. Longer than you'd think, she said, and faster than it should have. He thought about that. Were you always? He stopped, reconsidered. Were you military? Once, she said. He didn't push. Good kid. They came through a gap in the perimeter that was not the main gate. Riley had identified it on day 4 of her deployment and had said nothing about it to anyone because that was also something she did automatically identify exits map alternatives. Maintain options. The security officer would have wanted it patched. Riley had found it privately useful. She went through it now with Ramirez behind her, and they were inside the wire at 1023. The base was running at a different frequency than it had been at 0831 when she left. The skeleton crew that had been moving carefully and speaking softly in the hell-breath quiet of a base awaiting word from its operators was now something different. Still careful, still subdued, but underneath the surface a current of something that hadn't been there before. Word had come in from the canyon. The compound had been breached. The engineer was in custody. Every American operator was accounted for. 400. Zero lost. People knew that. They didn't fully understand it yet, the why of it, the how of it, but they knew the number, and the number was the kind of number that changed the air on a military base. The way a sudden shift in barometric pressure changes the air before a storm, except opposite. Not heavier, lighter, like the world had just exhaled something it had been holding since 0824. Riley crossed the base without stopping. She was aware of looks, not suspicious. Looks not yet just the low-frequency awareness that passes between people when something has changed and they're not sure what. Nobody stopped her. Nobody said anything. She went through the back door of the mess hall. She sat down on the overturned crate near the back wall where she had sat at 0731, in the clean pass before everything, and she set the rifle across her knees and she looked at her forearm. The laceration was longer than she had assessed in the field. That happened sometimes, the body's version of battlefield accounting, where the true cost didn't show up until the crisis had passed and the adrenaline stepped back and left the actual numbers on the table. She tilted her arm toward the light from the single window above the dry storage shelves, deep enough to need closure, not deep enough to be an emergency. She pulled a field medical kit from the second equipment case, the one nobody had ever asked about either because it sat beneath the same canvas tarpaulin as the rifle case and looked like a standard contractor first aid bag, and she got to work. She was 6 sutures in when Hayes walked through the back door. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He came through the door with the same directness he brought to everything, stopped when he saw her, and stood there for a moment taking in the full picture. The rifle across the crate, the medical kit open on the floor, the neat line of sutures in her forearm, the knee wrapped in a field dressing. She had applied one-handed with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before and would prefer not to have to do it again. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Walsh is on his way back." "I figured," Riley said. She tied off the 7th suture. "How long about? Convoy's about 40 minutes out." Hayes came further into the room. He didn't sit. He was a man who processed better standing. She had noticed that about him weeks ago. "The engineer is talking already. Intel says he has information on 3 additional cells." "Good," Riley said. 398 operators walked out of that canyon, Hayes said. 2 are on medical transport, non-critical wounds. He paused. None of them know why they're alive. Riley set down the suture needle and looked at her work. Clean enough, it would hold. They're alive because they trained hard and they moved right when the geometry changed. That's a generous interpretation. It's the accurate one, she said. I removed obstacles. They did the rest. Hayes looked at her for a long time. Not the way most people looked at her, skating over the surface, seeing the apron, seeing the serving line, seeing whatever role they had already assigned her. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since day 3 of the deployment, with the filed-away attentiveness of a man who had been waiting for the thing he suspected to finally show itself. "Who are you?" he asked, quietly, not aggressively, the way you ask a question when you already know you're only going to get part of the answer and you've decided that part is better than nothing. Riley looked at him. "I'm the cook," she said. Hayes almost smiled. Almost. "Right." He pulled a stool from beneath the prep table and sat on it, which meant he wasn't leaving, which she had also anticipated. She had anticipated all of this, not the specific conversation, but its shape. The shape of what happens when the thing you've been hiding performs itself in front of the wrong pair of eyes. "The rifle is a custom AXSR, Hayes said. "I looked up the platform this morning after I saw you go over the wire. That ammunition isn't standard issue anything. That suppressor system is not commercially available." He paused. "The biometric case is a detail that I think is very interesting." Riley said nothing. "I ran your contractor file," Hayes continued. "Riley Callahan, age 34, civilian contractor, food services, previous experience in institutional catering, security clearance standard level, no military service of record." He folded his hands on his knee. "There is not one word in that file that explains what I watched you do this morning." "Contractor files aren't always complete," Riley said. "No," Hayes agreed, "they're not, especially when someone goes to the specific trouble of making them incomplete." He looked at the rifle. That's a lot of trouble to go to for someone who just wanted to serve eggs. The mess hall was quiet. Outside, Riley could hear the low mechanical sounds of the base returning to a new version of its operational normal generator's vehicle's voices. The sounds of people who had just learned they were going to live today and were beginning to rearrange their understanding of the world accordingly. "Hayes," Riley said, "what do you want?" The truth would be a start. The truth is complicated. "I've been in this job for 19 years, Hayes said. "I am comfortable with complicated." She looked at him. She assessed him the way she assessed everything quickly from a wide base of experience weighing variables. What he was, what he wasn't, what he would do with what she told him, and what he would do with what she didn't. Hayes was the kind of man who kept things, not out of selfishness, out of understanding. He had spent 19 years in environments where information was both currency and liability, and he had learned the difference between things that needed to be shared and things that needed to be protected. He had logged her departure from the base as a civilian contractor leaving for unknown reasons. He had told the intelligence sergeant not to call it in. He had sent Ramirez to give her a radio rather than sending a security team to bring her back. He had done all of that before he knew what she was doing or what the outcome would be. That was the measure of him. She made her decision. "My name is not Riley Callahan," she said. "That's the name I operate under. It's clean enough that it holds under standard level inquiry, which is what most contractor vetters run." She set the medical kit aside and looked at him directly. "I was Navy, Bud/S Class 287, 8 years active duty, 2 of them in a specialized program that I am not going to name and that you are not going to find records of, regardless of how high up you go looking, because those records were destroyed deliberately, and the destruction was not an accident, and the people who ordered it had very specific reasons for doing it." Hayes hadn't moved. He was listening with the full stillness of a man who knew how to hear things. "The program was a deep cover intelligence and direct action capability," Riley continued. "Female operators embedded in non-military environments being used for long-term asset development and, when necessary, direct action. The theory was that a woman in a support role was invisible. In certain theaters, in certain contexts, that invisibility was more valuable than any amount of firepower you could bring to the table overtly." She paused. "The theory was correct. The execution had problems." "What kind of problems?" "The kind that result in a mission going wrong in a way that 3 governments have an interest in nobody ever discussing in public." She said it flatly, without self-pity, just the fact of it delivered like a range card entry. "I was the only survivor of that operation. When I came out, the program was shut down. My records were scrubbed. I was given a new identity, a new file, and a very clear message about what I was supposed to do with the rest of my life." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "And what were you supposed to do?" he asked. "Disappear," she said. Another pause. "You didn't disappear," Hayes said. "No," Riley said. "I got a job." Hayes looked around the mess hall, at the flat-top grills and the serving line and the coffee stations and the folded apron on the prep counter next to the cutting knife she had set down at 0831, like punctuation at the end of a sentence she'd been writing for 3 years. "FOB Griffin," he said. "This specific posting, you requested it." It wasn't a question. "I saw the operational brief for Desert Hammer in a channel I'm not supposed to have access to," she said. "The canyon approach route, the target compound, the timeline." She looked at him steadily. "I knew what it was going to be before any of you did." That landed. Hayes absorbed it with the stillness of a man who was very good at absorbing things that would have knocked other men sideways. "You requested a contractor posting at this specific FOB," he said slowly, "because you had read an operational brief through unauthorized access to a classified channel, and you assessed that the mission was going to go wrong, and you came here to—" He stopped. "To what?" "To cook. To be available," she said. The words sat in the air between them. Hayes looked at her for a long time, the kind of look that meant he was running the full architecture of what she had just told him through every frame of reference he had, checking it against everything he knew, looking for the thing that didn't fit. Then he said very quietly, "The operational brief was classified at a level that requires a specific security infrastructure to access. That infrastructure is not available to civilian contractors." No, Riley agreed. It's not. Which means, which means the things I told you about my past are true, she said. And which means the channel I accessed was not something a civilian contractor now should be able to access. And which means there are people in the intelligence community who are aware that I exist and aware of what I can do and aware that I am not entirely out of the game regardless of what the official record says. She held his gaze. And which means this conversation is going to create problems for both of us the moment it leaves this room. Hayes was quiet. The generator hummed outside. Somewhere across the base, a vehicle engine turned over. 398 operators, Hayes said finally. 398, Riley confirmed. He nodded slowly, just once. The nod of a man closing a particular file in his mind and deciding where to store it. Walsh is going to ask questions, he said. Walsh is going to ask a lot of questions. She agreed. What do you want me to tell him? Riley picked up her apron from the prep counter. She looked at it. She folded it the same way she had folded it at 0831 with the same neat economy, and she tied it back on around her waist. Tell him the cook had a good morning, she said. Hayes opened his mouth, closed it, looked at her, really looked at her the way he had been looking at her since day 3, except now he was looking at the thing itself instead of the outline of it. He looked at the woman who had requested a posting at a forward operating base in the mountains because she had read a classified brief through a channel she shouldn't have had and decided that 400 people were going to need something that only she could provide, and who had then spent 3 years building a cover that was specifically designed to make her invisible enough to be exactly where she needed to be without anyone understanding why. He looked at the apron. He looked at the rifle on the crate. He looked at the trident. She had set it on the prep table when she came back in next to the medical kit, and it sat there now catching the light from the single window, quiet and unmistakable. You were never going to tell anyone, he said. It came out different from how he meant it, not accusatory, almost wondering. Even if it had all gone right, even if nobody had followed you to the ridge, you were going to come back and fold your apron and serve lunch and not say a single word. Riley looked at him. The eggs needed restocking, she said. Hayes made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. It was the sound of a man encountering something his existing categories didn't have a slot for and deciding to just let it exist without a label. He stood up from the stool. He straightened. And then Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hayes, 19 years Navy Special Warfare, stood in the back room of a mess hall at Forward Operating Base Griffin and looked at Riley Callahan, whose name was not Riley Callahan, and brought his right hand up to the edge of his brow. A salute. Clean, full, real. The kind you give to someone who earned it in a place the record doesn't show. Riley looked at him for a moment. Then she turned to the flat-top grill and turned it on because the convoy was 40 minutes out and 400 operators were going to come back from the Devil's Anvil Canyon hungry, and that was her job, and she was going to do it. Hayes watched her for a moment. Then he walked to the mess hall door, put his hand on the frame, and stopped. Callahan, he said. She looked up. The wind, he said. This morning, from the north. You called it. She looked at him. I called it before the convoy left, she said. Nobody asked. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man understanding a very long chain of things simultaneously. Hayes nodded. He went through the door, and Riley turned back to the grill and started cracking eggs because the convoy was coming home, and the morning had been long, and the least she could do was make sure the eggs weren't runny when they arrived. Outside, the sandstorm that had closed the airspace was dissolving in the northwest piece by piece, the way all storms eventually dissolved when the mountain had taken everything from them they had to give. The canyon below was quiet, and in the mess hall of FOB Griffin, something that had been hidden for 3 years was still hidden because the woman who was hiding it had decided it should remain that way. For now. The first vehicles came through the gate at 11:42. Riley heard them before she saw them, the low diesel rumble that carried differently on a base that had been holding its breath for 3 hours and was now finally slowly starting to exhale. She was at the serving line. She had restocked it completely in the 40 minutes since Hayes had walked out the back door, moving through the kitchen with the same economy she brought to everything. Because the work was real and the men coming back would be hungry. And that was a fact that didn't care about anything else that had happened that morning. She kept her back to the door when the first operators came in. She heard them before she processed them, the sounds of men coming off a hard mission, which were different from the sounds of men going onto one. Going out there was compression and focus and the particular forward-leaning energy of people moving towards something. Coming back, especially from something like what the canyon had been, there was a different quality. Something looser, something that was trying to settle but hadn't found its shape yet, like water looking for the lowest point. The first man through the mess hall door was Kowalski. She knew his footstep. She had been listening to footsteps in mess halls for 3 years, and she knew his the way. You know the sound of your own front door. He didn't say anything. He came to the serving line and set his tray down, and she turned with the serving spoon already in her hand and looked at him. He looked different. Not hurt, she checked that first automatically, the triage reflex, but different in a way that went under the skin. His eyes had that particular quality that combat left behind, the flat, bright quality of a man who had been very close to dying and had come out the other side and hadn't yet figured out what to do with the extra time. Eggs, he said. Sitting right there, she said. He looked at the tray. He looked at her. He opened his mouth closed. It looked at the tray again. Something happened out there, he said. Not to her specifically. More to the universe, the same way he had talked about the runny eggs that morning, except 1,000 miles more serious. Something we can't explain. Riley put eggs on his tray. Eat, she said. You'll explain it better on a full stomach. He stared at her for another moment. Then he took the tray and moved to a table and sat down and started eating with the mechanical focus of a man whose body had made a unilateral decision to take over from his brain for a while. The mess hall filled fast. Operators came through in groups the way they always did post-mission, by squad, by element, by the organic clustering that formed in the field and persisted for a while afterward, like a tide line showing you where the water had been. They were loud and they were quiet simultaneously, which was a thing that only happened after a specific kind of operation, where the outcome had been different from the expectation in a direction nobody had prepared for. Riley served. She kept her head down and her hands moving, and she listened. The talk was all the same shape. 2 RPG teams just stopped. Nobody knows why. Both heavy positions on the west wall. Gone, like somebody reached down and switched them off. The sniper, the long gun on the east ridge, that's what broke it open. That's what gave us the gap. Delta support. Had to be. Ghost unit. Someone had eyes on that ridge that nobody briefed us on. Nobody from Delta is claiming it. I already asked. Blanket denial. Then who? Silence. Every time that question hit the same wall, nobody knew. And the not knowing was doing something specific to these men, not frightening them exactly, but unsettling them in a way that was almost philosophical. They were operators. They operated inside a world that was built on information, on knowing the order of battle, on knowing your assets, on knowing who was on your side and where they were positioned and what they could bring to the fight. The idea that something had worked for them this morning from a position and a source they couldn't identify was sitting in the middle of their professional framework like a stone in a still pond, sending ripples into everything. Riley kept serving eggs. Walsh came in at 12:04. She heard him before she saw him, his voice in the corridor outside, still on the radio, still running the bureaucratic aftermath of the operation, because that was what commanding officers did. When the shooting stopped, they immediately became administrators again. She had seen it 100 times. The transition from warrior to paperwork happened faster than anyone ever admitted. He came through the door and stopped. He looked at the room, full tables, his operators eating and talking and decompressing in the specific way that people decompressed after surviving something they shouldn't have survived, and something moved across his face that was complicated and fast, and she didn't try to name it. Then he looked at the serving line, at her. He stood there for a moment, just stood there. Then he walked to the serving line and picked up a tray. She served him without a word. He stood there with his tray and looked at her the way Hayes had looked at her, but different from Hayes. Hayes had looked at her with the attentiveness of a man piecing together a puzzle he had been building for weeks. Walsh was looking at her with something raw, something that hadn't been processed yet. There were tracks on Watchtower Ridge, he said. She met his eyes. There are tracks all over these mountains, she said. It's rough terrain. These tracks were specific, Walsh said. Firing position, multiple positions, cartridge casings from a .338 Norma Magnum, and blood. He held her gaze. 2 different patterns, a laceration and a contusion. Someone was up there and they were wounded and they were shooting from positions that required climbing the back face of the ridge, which nobody in my command briefed as a viable approach because we all assumed it was impossible. Riley said nothing. I sent 2 of my best climbers up that ridge this morning after we secured the compound, Walsh continued. Took them 40 minutes to make the approach that whoever was up there made in. He stopped. How long did it take you? The mess hall had gotten quieter. Not silent, these were professional operators. They knew how to maintain their own conversations. They were not a dining room full of eavesdroppers. But the quality of the ambient noise had shifted in the specific way noise shifts when a room becomes collectively aware that something important is happening in a particular corner of it. Riley set down her serving spoon. She looked at Walsh directly. 18 minutes, she said. The quiet got a little deeper. Walsh stared at her. She watched him process at what the number meant, what it implied about the climb, and the person who had made it, and what that person had then done at the top of it. The cook, he said, very quietly. The cook, she confirmed. Walsh set his tray on the serving line counter. He turned and looked at his room at his operators, some of whom had stopped pretending they weren't listening, all of whom were wearing versions of the same expression, which was the expression of men whose framework for the morning was being rewritten in real time. He turned back to her. I need to understand what happened up there, he said. You already understand it, Riley said. The geometry changed. Your people moved when it changed. They did their jobs. And you did yours, Walsh said. She picked the serving spoon back up. I made eggs this morning, she said. I'm going to keep making them. If you want to debrief the tactical situation, you should do that with Hayes. Walsh looked at her for another long moment. Then he picked his tray back up, turned and walked to the table where Hayes was sitting, because Hayes had come in while Walsh was talking and had taken the table nearest the serving line, and Riley had clocked him the moment he walked in and had said nothing. And Hayes was now sitting with a cup of coffee and the specific expression of a man who has just watched someone handle a very difficult situation and is filing the performance away for future reference. Walsh sat down across from Hayes. He said something low that Riley couldn't hear from the serving line. Hayes said something back. Walsh said something else. Hayes picked up his coffee cup and said one more thing. Walsh sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the room. He looked at the serving line. Riley had already turned back to the grill. She heard Walsh say behind her to the room in general, whatever happened on that ridge this morning, whoever was up there, they gave us something that none of us are going to be able to fully explain. I am not going to try to explain it here. What I will say is that 400 of us came home today when we should not have. He paused. That is the end of the debrief. No one said anything. Then Kowalski said from his table without looking up from his eggs, the eggs are better today. A sound moved through the room that was close enough to a laugh. Riley kept her back to them and kept working. At 13:18, the intelligence packet from the captured engineer started coming through the command post. Hayes pulled Riley from the serving line without explaining why to anyone, and she followed him across the base to the operations tent, and the intelligence officer waiting there looked at Hayes when they walked in, and then looked at Riley and said very carefully, Chief Hayes, this is a classified briefing. I know, Hayes said. She stays. The intelligence officer, Captain Yolanda Marsh, whose file Riley had read 6 weeks ago, when she first arrived at Griffin, looked at Riley with an expression that was professionally neutral and privately very confused. She's a burn. She stays, Hayes said. Marsh looked at him, looked at Riley, made a decision that Riley could see her making in real time based on the fact that Hayes had spent 19 years building a reputation for being exactly right about exactly this kind of thing. Fine, Marsh said. Close the tent. The engineer's name was Tariq Yusuf al-Rashid, and he was talking because he was smart enough to understand what talking bought him and what not talking cost him. He had given up 3 cell locations, 2 operational timelines, and a supply route that the intelligence community had been trying to map for 14 months. All of it was good. All of it checked against existing signal intelligence in ways that confirmed it was real. And then he had given up something else, something that Marsh was now looking at on the laptop screen in front of her, with an expression that Riley had learned to read in operations officers over 8 years, the expression of someone who has received information that is simultaneously valuable and extremely dangerous, and is trying to calculate in real time who needs to know it and who needs to not know it. He gave up a name, Marsh said. Hayes leaned forward. What name? Marsh looked at Riley, not at Hayes, at Riley. Riley felt the thing before she understood it, the way you sometimes feel weather before it arrives. He said the ambush this morning was not improvised, Marsh said. The positioning, the timing, the route selection, all of it was engineered by an outside source. An advisor, someone with deep knowledge of American military tactics and special operations doctrine. She paused. Someone who knew the Devil's Anvil approach route would be selected for this operation because they had access to the operational planning process. The air in the operations tent went very still. He gave up a name, Hayes said again. Not a question this time. He gave up a code name, Marsh said, the advisor's operational alias. She looked at Riley. Callahan. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Riley had experienced since she had pressed her thumb to the biometric lock that morning. Hayes turned and looked at her. The full weight of 19 years behind his eyes, and underneath that weight, for the first time since she had known him, something that looked almost like uncertainty. That's your name, he said, very carefully. That's my contractor name, she said. Her voice was level. She was running calculations at a speed that the situation demanded, and her face was doing none of it. Someone knew my posting. Someone knew the name on my contractor file, and they used it as an operational alias for the advisor. She held Hayes's gaze, which means someone in the intelligence architecture around this operation knows I'm here, and they want you to know they know. Hayes stared at her. That's not a coincidence, he said. No, Riley said. It's a message. Marsh was watching this exchange with the expression of someone who has just realized she is in a meeting that is significantly more complicated than the meeting she thought she was in. Does someone want to explain to me what is happening right now? No, Hayes and Riley said simultaneously. Marsh looked at both of them. Then she looked at her laptop. Then she closed it. I'm going to get more coffee, she said, and stood up and left the tent, which was either professional discretion or self-preservation, and was probably both. When she was gone, Hayes looked at Riley with the full, unguarded directness that he had been maintaining professional distance from all morning. Someone set this up, he said. The ambush, the timing, the route selection, and then they used your name as the signature. Yes, Riley said. They knew you were here. Yes. And they knew that you'd respond, that you'd go up that ridge. Riley was quiet for a moment. The calculation she was running had a lot of moving pieces, and some of them were still uncertain, but the shape of the answer was becoming clear. The way shapes became clear when you had enough data points to connect them. They knew that if the mission went wrong in a specific enough way, she said slowly, the only person at FOB Griffin capable of responding effectively was me, and they set it up to go wrong in exactly that specific way. She looked at Hayes. The canyon approach, the ridge positions, the timing of the sandstorm closing air support. All of it was too perfect. Hayes absorbed this. Someone engineered a situation that would force you to reveal yourself, he said. Someone engineered a situation that would force me to reveal myself, she confirmed. And they used 400 operators as the mechanism. The weight of that sat between them like something physical. Hayes stood up. He paced 3 steps to the tent wall and stopped. He turned around. Who knows you exist? Who has the access level and the motive to? That is a very long list, Riley said. And most of it is classified above your clearance level. And mine currently. She paused. But whoever it is, they just made a mistake. Hayes looked at her. What mistake? They used my name, she said. They wanted me to know they knew. That means they want something. And people who want something are people who can be found. Hayes was quiet. Outside the tent, the base was moving through its early afternoon rhythms. Vehicles, voices, the ordinary mechanical sounds of a military installation that had just survived a catastrophic morning and was already metabolizing it into operational memory. What do you need? Hayes said finally. Riley looked at him. That was the question, clean and direct and without precondition, the way Hayes always asked things. Not what are you going to do? Not what should I do? Not how do I protect my career or my clearance or my position in the chain of command that was already going to be complicated by everything that had happened since 0823. Just what do you need? She thought about it. Access to Marsh's intel packet, she said. The full engineer debrief, not the summary. and the signal intelligence cross-reference from the last 30 days on the canyon approach route. I can get that. And I need Walsh. Hayes raised an eyebrow. Walsh. He traced the shell casings to the ridge, Riley said. He's already halfway to the right answer, and he's going to keep going until he gets there. I need him inside the conversation rather than outside it. Hayes considered this. Walsh is arrogant and overconfident, and he took his people into a canyon on thin intel because he didn't want to hear the questions that didn't fit his plan, Riley said. And today he came back from that canyon with 398 people when he should have come back with none. That changes a man if you know how to use it. Hayes looked at her for a moment. You've been reading people in this mess hall for 3 weeks, he said. That's what mess halls are for, she said. He almost smiled. Almost. I'll get Walsh, he said. Give me 20 minutes. He went through the tent flap. Riley sat alone in the operations tent with the closed laptop in the afternoon light coming through the canvas and the distant sounds of the base, and a problem that was significantly larger than the one she had climbed a ridge to solve that morning. She had revealed herself, not completely, not to the base at large, not to the chain of command, not to anyone who was going to put it in a report tonight, but to Hayes, to Walsh in the way that mattered, to Ramirez, who had been smart enough to see and quiet enough to hold it, and to whoever had used her name as their calling card on a classified intelligence product from a captured bomb maker in the Devil's Anvil Canyon. That last one was the problem. That last one was what she had been afraid of in the part of herself that she had spent 3 years keeping very quiet since the day she requested this posting and folded the contractor identity around herself like a set of work clothes and told herself she was just going to be available, just in case, just near enough to help if it went wrong. It had gone wrong. She had helped. And now someone who knew her real name and her real history had signed their work with her alias and left it in the mouth of a captured engineer, like a message in a bottle aimed at the one person in the world who would understand exactly what it meant. She thought about the enemy commander, the cigarette, the canyon. Not one of them comes home today. She thought about Kowalski eating his eggs and saying the eggs are better today and the sound the room made that was close enough to a laugh. She thought about Hayes' salute in the back room of the mess hall, clean and full and real. She thought about whoever had set this up, whoever had known she was here, whoever had used 400 lives as a mechanism to force her hand and then signed it with her name like a declaration of intent. She reached into her pocket and took out the range card she had made over 3 weeks of early mornings on the ridge. She turned it over. On the blank backside, in the same small, precise handwriting she used for distance and elevation and wind correction, she wrote 2 words. Not a target, not a calculation, a reminder. She wrote not done. She folded the range card and put it back in her pocket. Walsh came through the tent flap at 1347. Hayes behind him, and the expression on Walsh's face was different from the expression she had last seen on it at the serving line. The arrogance had been replaced by something that looked almost like humility, which she had not expected to arrive this quickly, but which she understood because the canyon had been a very efficient teacher. She looked at both of them. Sit down, she said. We have a problem that is bigger than this morning. They sat, and Riley Callahan, who was not Riley Callahan, who had climbed an impossible ridge and shot 10 rounds that had saved 400 lives and come back down and made eggs, and tied on her apron and hoped the world would leave her alone for a little while longer, began to explain the problem. Walsh listened without interrupting. That was the first sign that the canyon had genuinely changed him. The Walsh who had stood at the mission briefing at 0530 and said intel is confident. Chief we move at 0600 was a man who spoke more than he listened and moved faster than he thought. The Walsh sitting across from Riley in the operations tent at 1347 was doing neither of those things. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on her face, and he was taking in every word with the full weight of a man who had spent 4 hours in a canyon learning what overconfidence actually costs. Riley laid it out clean and fast, no softening, no editorial, just the structure of the problem, the way she saw it in the same way she had laid out wind correction and elevation data on the ridge. Here is the calculation, here are the variables, here is what the math produces. Someone inside the American intelligence architecture had known she was at FOB Griffin, had known her contractor alias, had known or correctly predicted that if the mission went catastrophically wrong in a specific enough way, she would respond. And that person had engineered the morning the ambush, the positioning, the sandstorm timing, with enough precision to suggest either extraordinary operational resources or extraordinary access to American planning systems. Possibly both. And then they had signed it, used her name, left it in the mouth of a captured engineer like a challenge coin dropped on a table. Look what I know. Come find me, or don't. Either way, you're not hidden anymore. Walsh absorbed all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Who have you told about this, you two?" Riley said. "And Ramirez knows I was on the ridge. He doesn't know the rest." "Ramirez won't talk," Hayes said, not as a question. "No," Riley agreed. "He won't." Walsh looked at Hayes. "We have a problem with the official record," he said. "The after-action report goes up tonight. I have to account for the tactical reversal in the canyon. I have to explain why 2 heavy positions and a sniper and 2 additional emplacements all went offline inside of 48 minutes from an unknown source." He paused. "I cannot write ghost in the explanation field." "No," Hayes said, "you can't." "So what do I write?" Both of them looked at Riley. She had thought about this on the descent from the ridge. She had thought about it while she was suturing her arm on the overturned crate. She had thought about it while she was cracking eggs and listening to Kowalski say the eggs are better today. The official record problem was not new. It was the same problem that had followed her entire career. The same problem the program had been built around. How do you account for a capability that officially doesn't exist? You write that a classified special operations asset with Overwatch capability made contact with your element during the engagement, she said. Asset identity and chain of command are above your clearance level. Asset is no longer on station. Action was consistent with authorized support parameters. She held Walsh's gaze. That language is accurate. It protects the record, and it closes the question for anyone below a certain clearance level. Walsh stared at her. That language implies a pre-planned asset deployment. Yes, Riley said, it does, which is not what happened. No, she agreed, it's not. Walsh sat with Braden for a moment. She watched him weigh at the professional, the ethical, the practical. The thing that happened in a man's chest when he was being asked to write something that was true in structure and incomplete in substance, and when the reason for the incompleteness was sitting across the table from him with sutures in her arm and a knee that was visibly swollen and the absolute steadiness of someone who had made this particular calculation many times before. "If I write that," Walsh said slowly, "I am protecting you." "You are protecting the record," Riley said, "and the 398 people in your mess hall right now who are alive because of what that record doesn't say." Silence. Then Walsh said something that Riley had not expected him to say in a voice that was the quietest she had ever heard from him. "I should have listened this morning at the briefing. When Hayes asked about unconfirmed positions, I should have, Stop," Riley said, not harshly. "That's a conversation for another time. Right now, we have a more immediate problem than the after-action report." Walsh looked up. "The person who used my name," she said, "they didn't do it to expose me to you. You were incidental. They did it because they wanted me to know that they know. And the only reason someone does that, the only reason you show your hand to an adversary in that specific way, is because you want them to move." Hayes leaned forward. "Move where?" "Toward them," Riley said, "or away. Either direction serves their purpose. If I run, they have confirmed that I can be flushed. If I move toward them, they've drawn me out of cover and onto ground of their choosing." She paused. "It's a very clean trap." "Then you don't move," Walsh said. "You stay here. You stay behind the serving line. You let us run it up the chain and let the intelligence community." "The intelligence community is where the leak came from," Riley said. "Flat, clear. Whoever knows I'm here has access to classified operational planning at a level that means they are inside the architecture, not outside it. If I run it up the chain, I am handing the information to the same system that already has a hole in it." The tent was very quiet. Outside a vehicle engine, voices, the base moving through its afternoon. "So what do you do?" Hayes said. Riley reached into her pocket and set the range card on the table, the side with the handwriting facing up. "Not done." Hayes read it. Walsh read it. Neither of them said anything. "I find the hole," Riley said, "from inside, which means I need the full engineer debrief, the signal intel cross-reference, and access to the operational planning record for Desert Hammer going back to the original brief. She looked at both of them. And I need it before the after-action report goes up tonight, because once it goes up, whoever is watching this will know that I know, and the window closes. Walsh looked at Hayes. Hayes looked at Riley. Then Hayes stood up without a word and went out through the tent flap. Walsh stayed. He sat with his hands still flat on the table and looked at the range card with the 2 words on it. Not done. He looked at it the way men looked at things that were rearranging their understanding of the world at a speed they weren't entirely comfortable with. How long have you been doing this, he asked, not the question he had asked before, not who are you, not what are you, but this specific question, which was different, which was the question underneath all the other questions. Riley considered it. Since I was 22, she said. Walsh looked up. That's 12 years. Yes. And in those 12 years, the program, the deep cover, the posting here, how many times did you have to do what you did this morning? She looked at him steadily. This is the first time I did it without orders. That landed somewhere specific in Walsh. She watched it land. Watched the thing move across his face that was partly respect and partly something more complicated. The specific complication of a commanding officer understanding that a person under his nominal authority had made a unilateral combat decision that his entire command structure had been incapable of making, and that the decision had been correct. The wind was picking up from the north, he said, quietly, repeating it. You said that to Hayes in the mess hall. He paused. You knew before we rolled out. I noticed, she said, carefully. I didn't know. But you suspected. I suspected the approach route had vulnerabilities that the intel assessment hadn't accounted for. Yes. Walsh was quiet for a long moment. Why didn't you say something? Riley looked at him. The question sat there between them, honest and real, and carrying the full weight of the morning. Why didn't you say something? The question that the frayed rifle sling and the shifting wind and the tactical overconfidence in the briefing room all pointed back to. The question that had an answer she had been living with since 06, 01, when the last vehicle went through the gate and she went back into the mess hall and started prepping for a lunch that she hadn't known yet whether anyone would come back to eat. Because I was the cook, she said. Walsh flinched. It was small and controlled, and he recovered fast, but she saw it. That's on me, he said. It's on the system, she said. You are the system. But yes, he didn't argue. That was the second sign that the canyon had changed him. Hayes came back through the tent flap at 1412 with a laptop and a physical folder, and Marsh 2 steps behind him wearing an expression that had moved past confused and into something that looked like determined professional neutrality, which was the intelligence officer's version of, I have decided to be useful and ask questions later. I pulled the full debrief, Marsh said, setting the laptop on the table, and the signal intel cross-reference. 30 days. She looked at Riley. I also pulled the operational planning record for Desert Hammer from initial concept through final brief. A pause, which required a clearance authorization that I technically do not have the authority to grant myself. So if anyone asks, Hayes requested it, and I processed it as a routine intel support function. Nobody's going to ask, Hayes said. People are going to ask, Marsh said. I am choosing to handle that when it happens, rather than now. She opened the laptop and turned it to face Riley. What are we looking for? Riley looked at the screen. The planning record, she said. Start at the beginning. The original operational concept. Who drafted it, who reviewed it, who had access at each stage of development. Marsh pulled up the document chain. Riley read fast. She always had. It was a specific skill that the program had identified early and developed extensively the ability to process written material at high speed and retain the structural elements while filtering the noise. She moved through the planning record the way she moved through everything quickly, without appearing to hurry, with a specific quality of attention that looked like stillness, but was actually the opposite. The operational concept for Desert Hammer had been drafted 9 weeks ago. It had passed through 4 review layers before reaching the final brief. At each review layer, access had been logged, who read it when from what terminal. She found the anomaly at the 3rd review layer. It was small, the kind of small that was designed to be small, designed to look like a routine access log entry rather than something that mattered. A single read access event logged from a terminal in a facility that was plausible enough to belong in the chain, a regional intelligence fusion center that had legitimate reason to be reading Desert Hammer planning documents, but that had accessed the document 47 minutes outside the standard review window. 47 minutes, not inside the review period, not before it, after it, after the review was closed and the document had moved to the next layer. Someone had gone back in, after the review closed, to read it again or to read something specific in it. Riley looked at the terminal ID. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "Marsh, run this terminal ID against the access logs for the original program archive, my program, the one that was shut down." Marsh looked at her. "That archive is—" "I know what it is," Riley said. "Run it." Marsh ran it. The result came back in 40 seconds. The terminal ID appeared in the program archive access log exactly once, 14 months ago. 3 weeks before a deep cover operation in a theater Riley was not going to name had gone catastrophically wrong in a way that 3 governments had an interest in nobody ever discussing in public. The room was very quiet. Walsh said, "What does that mean?" Hayes said nothing. He was looking at Riley. He already understood the shape of it. She could see that not the specific details, not the names in the operational history, but the shape, the terrible, clean shape of it. "It means the operation that burned my program 14 months ago wasn't a failure," Riley said. Her voice was level. It was the hardest level she had ever maintained. "It was a product. Someone used access to classified planning systems to feed operational details to the other side. The same someone who went back into the Desert Hammer planning document 47 minutes after the review window closed." She paused. "The same someone who knew I was at FOB Griffin and knew my contractor alias and used it to sign their work this morning." "They've been doing this for 14 months, Hayes said. "On a minimum," Riley said. "And they signed it today because they wanted me to find it," Riley said. "They showed me exactly enough to follow the thread. The name in the engineer's debrief, the timing, the access log anomaly that is just detectable enough to find if you're looking with the right background." She looked at the terminal ID on the screen. "This is an invitation." Walsh said, "To what?" Riley looked at him. "To finish it," she said. The terminal ID resolved to a name after another 6 minutes of Marsh working through the access architecture with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided she was already too far into this to stop. The name was not someone Riley knew personally. It was someone she knew of, a mid-level intelligence coordinator with access to multiple operational planning systems and a career history that moved cleanly between agencies in a way that was either a sign of exceptional competence or exceptional utility, depending on which side of the equation you were standing on. The name was Daniel Rourke. She said it aloud once. Then she was quiet for a moment because the implications were very large and very fast, and she needed to let them settle into a shape she could work with. Rourke was not a field operator. He was not a shooter, not a handler, not any operational role that she could identify from the access logs in the career record Marsh was pulling up. He was the thing that was in some ways more dangerous than any of those. He was a man who sat inside the information system and understood exactly how to use that position to shape events at a distance. He had used it to burn her program 14 months ago. He had used it today to force her hand. And he had left both of his fingerprints in places where they could be found, which meant either he was arrogant enough to believe he was untouchable, or he was precise enough to be controlling what happened next. She thought about which one was true. She thought about the enemy commander who had lit a cigarette and looked down at the canyon and said, "Not one of them comes home today." She thought about the 6 months of patient preparation that had built a kill box so perfect that 400 elite operators had walked into it without seeing the walls. She thought about the kind of mind that could wait that long and plan that precisely. Rourke had waited 14 months. That was not arrogance. That was something else. "He wants a meeting," Riley said. Everyone in the tent looked at her. "The entire construction of this morning," she said slowly, "the signature, the access log trail, it's too clean to be accidental and too deliberate to be a threat. Someone who wanted to eliminate me would not leave a traceable trail in a classified planning system. Someone who wanted to expose me would have done it differently." She looked at the name on the screen. He left a breadcrumb. He engineered a situation that forced me to reveal a capability, and then he left a trail back to himself that only someone with my background could follow. "That's not a threat. That's a calling card." Walsh said, "That's insane." "That's a very specific kind of professional," Riley said. Hayes was quiet. Then you're going to follow it. It was not a question. I'm going to follow it, she said. Walsh leaned forward. Callahan, Riley, whatever your name is, you cannot go after a mid-level intelligence coordinator who just burned 400 of my people. We need to go up the chain. We need to brief this to someone who has the authority to. The chain has a hole in it, Riley said. We established that. Then we find the part of the chain that doesn't have a hole. Walsh? Her voice was quiet and complete. The voice of someone who has made a calculation and arrived at an answer and is done running the math. I have been inside this system for 8 years. I know how long it takes to move an action through a compromised chain to a clean authority. I know what happens to the evidence trail in that time. I know what Rourke can do with 48 hours of warning. She held his gaze. And I know what I can do in 48 hours if nobody knows I'm moving. The tent was silent for a long moment. Then Walsh did something she had not predicted. He reached into his shirt pocket and set something on the table between them. A challenge coin, SEAL teams, the kind that got passed between operators after something had been through the fire together. He set it down and pushed it toward her across the table. He didn't say anything. Riley looked at it. She looked at Walsh. The Walsh who had said intel is confident chief we move at 0600. The Walsh who had come back from the canyon with 398 people and sat in the mess hall and said something happened out there that we can't explain. The Walsh who had just pushed a challenge coin across the table toward a woman whose real name he didn't know and said everything he needed to say without a single word. She picked it up. She held it for a moment. Then she set it back on the table and pushed it toward him. Hold on to it, she said. I'll collect it when it's done. Hayes made the sound that was not quite a laugh. Walsh picked the coin back up. Marsh closed the laptop. The tent held all of them for a moment, the intelligence officer who had authorized herself into classified archives. The commanding officer who had learned in a canyon what overconfidence cost the chief who had stood in a mess hall doorway on day 3 and filed away something he couldn't name. And the cook who was not a cook and never had been and had spent 3 years folding her apron every morning and watching everything and saying nothing and waiting for the moment that the calculation demanded something other than patience. That moment had been this morning. This moment was different. This moment was what came after. Riley stood up. She picked up the range card from the table. Not done. She put it in her pocket. She looked at Hayes. The after-action report, she said. You know what it needs to say. I know, he said. She looked at Walsh. Your people need a debrief. Give them one. Keep it clean. Give them the framework that lets them process what happened without the parts they don't need to carry. I know how to take care of my people, Walsh said. Quietly, without edge. Just the fact. I know you do, she said, and meant it. She looked at Marsh. The access log, the terminal record, the name. Goes nowhere, Marsh said, until you tell me otherwise. Riley nodded. She walked to the tent flap. She stopped. She turned back and looked at all 3 of them one more time, Hayes with his coffee, Walsh with his coin, Marsh with her laptop closed and her hands folded, in the expression of a woman who had just decided something important about the kind of officer she was going to be. She thought about Ramirez on the ridge holding his radio, saying yes, ma'am, in a voice that was trying to be steadier than he felt. She thought about Kowalski eating eggs and making the whole room almost laugh. She thought about the folded apron on the prep counter and the trident next to the medical kit and Hayes' salute clean and full and real. She thought about the enemy commander with his cigarette and his certainty. She thought about Rourke somewhere inside a system that he had spent 14 months using as a weapon, waiting to see which direction she moved. She thought about Daniel Rourke's terminal ID, accessing a planning document 47 minutes after the review window closed, and the 14 months between that moment and this one, and all the people who had been moved around the board in that time like pieces in a game that most of them didn't know they were playing. The wind was picking up from the north, she said. Nobody in the tent fully understood it as the closing of a loop. Hayes came closest. He looked at her with those filed-away eyes and gave one small nod that said, I hear you. I understand. Go. She went through the tent flap. The base moved around her. Vehicles and voices and the ordinary sounds of a place that had survived something and was now doing what military installations always did after surviving something, continuing. Maintaining, pressing forward into the next operational moment, because stopping was not a mode that this world knew how to inhabit. She crossed the base to the mess hall. She went through the back door. She stood for a moment in the space that had been her world for 3 weeks. The flat-top grills, the serving line, the coffee stations, the dry storage shelves, the equipment, cases under the canvas tarpaulin that she was going to have to move tonight before this posting became a problem she couldn't manage. She picked up her apron from the prep counter. She held it for a moment, then she set it down. Not folded this time. Just set it down the way you set something down when you're done with it, when the thing it represented has run its course and the next thing is already waiting and there's no point in ceremony. She picked up the trident. She held it the way she had held the challenge coin, not reverently, not sentimentally, but with the clean acknowledgement of what it was and what it had cost and what it still meant, regardless of every official document that said otherwise. She put it in her pocket. She picked up the rifle case. She picked up the ballistic kit. She walked out of the mess hall of Forward Operating Base Griffin for the last time at 15:01 hours on a day when 400 operators had walked into a canyon that was supposed to be their grave and walked back out again because of one shot from an impossible distance on an unclimbable ridge fired by a woman whose file said she made eggs for a living. Ramirez was waiting outside. She stopped. He was standing there in his signals uniform with his hands in his pockets and the expression of someone who has been working something out in his head for a few hours, and he has arrived at a conclusion they're not sure what to do with. "Ma'am," he said. "Ramirez, I just wanted to—" He stopped. Tried again. "I wanted to say, up on the ridge, when you told me to get behind the rock and stay there." He paused. "I wasn't scared." She looked at him. "Yes, you were," she said, not unkindly. He thought about it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I was, but not of what was happening." He met her eyes. "I was scared I was going to be in the way." Riley looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You weren't in the way." He nodded, once, the nod of someone receiving a thing they needed. "Are you going to be okay?" he asked, and meant it the simple way, not the operational way, not the tactical way, the human way. The way 22-year-olds asked it when they had watched something happen and couldn't figure out any other way to respond. Riley thought about the answer. She thought about Rourke's terminal ID and the 14 months and the clean, terrible patience of a man who had used a war as a message. She thought about the range card in her pocket and the trident and the challenge coin Walsh was holding and the after-action report that would go up tonight and say exactly what it needed to say and nothing more. She thought about what the next 48 hours required and what came after that and how long the thread was that she was about to follow into a system that already had one hole in it that she knew of. She thought about all of it. Then she looked at Ramirez and said, "Ask me in 48 hours. He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." She walked past him toward the eastern perimeter. She did not look back. Some people moved through the world demanding to be seen, demanding recognition, rank acknowledgement of what they carried and what they cost and what they gave. Riley Callahan had never been that. She had been the thing that existed in the gap between what people looked at and what they saw, and she had been useful in that gap, and she had been necessary in that gap, and she had been in her own private understanding, something that the world occasionally needed and almost never deserved. She had saved 400 people that morning, not because she was ordered to, not because she was recognized, not because anyone would ever fully know or fully understand or be able to write it in a report that said exactly what had happened and why. She had done it because the geometry demanded it, and she was the only person at FOB Griffin who could read the geometry, and now the geometry demanded something else, and she was still the only person who could read it. The eastern perimeter opened ahead of her. The mountain waited beyond it. The trail down toward the valley and beyond the valley toward whatever Rourke was waiting and patient and deliberate and certain that he controlled the next move. He was wrong about that. That was the thing about Rourke and the enemy commander and every man who had ever looked at Riley Callahan and seen the apron and the serving line and the exhausted eyes and decided she was exactly what she appeared to be. They were always wrong about that. She walked through the perimeter. She moved into the mountain. The cook was gone. The operator was just getting started. 2/2